The Houston Texans just walked out of Las Vegas with a win that does not feel safe at all. The scoreboard says 23-21 over the Raiders. The streak moves to 7 straight wins. The playoff path stays open, and on the surface, that looks like a dream. But the feeling around this team is very different. It feels like the kind of night where a contender survives, looks in the mirror, and has to ask a hard question. Did they prove they are built for January, or did they quietly show every strong team in the AFC exactly where to attack them? You can see both sides in the same game. On one side, you have stars who delivered when everything was wobbling. Derek Stingley Jr. jumps a route and takes it back for his first pick six when the offense is stuck. Nico Collins lays out for a ridiculous grab that freezes the stadium and closes the door. Will Anderson Jr. and Danielle Hunter get home at the edge of drives that were starting to tilt toward Las Vegas. Fairbairn walks out perfect on kicks again, and those points are the reason the Texans are talking about seeding instead of heartbreak. On the other side, you saw C.J. Stroud searching for rhythm. The run game swallowed at the line, and a defense that had to live with long bursts and broken tackles instead of their usual clean control. That mix of clutch and chaos is why this win feels so loud and so uncomfortable at the same time. Now the pressure shifts from the field to the meeting rooms. D'Amico Ryans has built a culture that talks about effort, swarm, and standard every single week. And nights like this are where that talk gets tested for real. Nick Caley has to take an offense that just looked flat against a 2-win team and turn it back into the aggressive, balanced group that scared people earlier in the season, because the next test comes with Justin Herbert and the Chargers defense ready to copy everything the Raiders just did. The Texans did enough to stay alive. They proved they can find answers late. But the real story starts when you rewind this tape and ask one simple question that leads straight into the next part of this breakdown. How did this offense lose its identity so quickly? And what has to change before they step on the field again? But before we get into that, hit that like and subscribe button for more Texans and all the NFL content. Let's aim for 500 likes on this video. The strange part of this game is that the Houston Texans offense never really felt like itself. This is a group that usually sets a tone, leans on the ground game, then lets C.J. Stroud slice up coverages once the defense starts to creep forward. Against Las Vegas, it looked like a completely different unit. Every early carry for Nick Chubb or Jawhar Jordan felt heavy, like they were running into a wall that got thicker with every snap. You could feel the frustration grow drive after drive as the Texans kept trying to play their normal style, but the Raiders front refused to move aim. A big reason for that was the work from Max Crosby and the Vegas front seven. They were ready for everything Nick Caley wanted to build off the ground game. There were snaps where Ariante Ursary, Trent Brown, Jake Andrews, Ed Ingram, Titus Howard, and Blake Fisher held up long enough in pass protection. But on runs, you saw backs getting touched in the backfield again and again. That killed the usual play action shots that once sprung woody marks and opened deep windows for the pass game. On short yardage calls, the Texans played it safe, chose kicks over risk, and it left the whole unit feeling careful instead of confident. For a team that wants to feel like the aggressor, nothing stings more than looking that passive against a defense that came in with only a few wins. Now the Texans have to decide what they want this side of the ball to be when the season is on the line. Do they keep banging their head against stacked boxes and hope the same calls suddenly start working? Or do they shift the focus and put even more on the arm and mind of C.J. Stroud? The line showed they can keep him clean, long enough to work. The question is whether the quarterback and the play caller can rebuild a rhythm that does not need perfect ground yards to function. That is where this story goes next, because this game was not just about a scheme that stalled. It was also about how C.J. Stroud handled one of the most confusing nights of his season. The strangest part of this game is that it was not C.J. Stroud running for his life. It was C.J. Stroud looking rushed when nobody was actually chasing him. The film shows clean pockets, time to scan, receivers breaking open, and then the ball sailing just out of reach, or coming out half a beat late. Box score people will stare at a line like 23 of 35 for 187 yards and 1 touchdown, and say it was fine. Anyone who watched every snap knows it did not feel fine. This was the night where you look at your franchise quarterback and quietly ask if he is still stuck in between who he was last season and who he needs to be when the games really tighten up. The tough truth for Texans fans is that this is not about one throw or one drive. It is about the standard C.J. Stroud set for himself in his first seasons. That version hit simple crossers in stride, trusted his reads, and made the easy stuff look automatic. In Las Vegas, you saw him second-guess open routes, underneath, hesitate on rhythm throws, and only lock back in when the game was on the line, and he absolutely had to feed Nico Collins. That is why this performance hit so hard. You still see the talent, the calm body language, the arm that can punish tight coverage, but you also see a player who has not yet matched that earlier level for a full 4 quarters in this season. In the background, Davis Mills has already shown he can come in cold and close drives during this win streak, which is exactly the kind of quiet pressure that forces C.J. Stroud to sharpen up without the team ever needing to start a drama. Now the entire AFC picture raises the bar even higher for him. Trevor Lawrence is starting to look like the engine of a real contender in Jacksonville. Drake May is growing fast in New England. Justin Herbert is waiting with a Chargers offense that punishes every mistake on the other sideline. Those are the quarterbacks C.J. Stroud will be judged against in the next few years, not just on highlights, but on how they carry their offenses when nothing is easy. The good news for Houston is that a lot of his issues from this game are fixable, and some of them start with what is happening in front of him. If the Texans can reshape the pocket and the run support around him, then the next step of this offense is not just on his shoulders. It is on the big men in the trenches, who either make his job simple or turn every drive into a grind. For all the talk about chaos on offense, the big surprise from this game is what the tape shows in the pocket. C.J. Stroud was not stuck in survival mode. The protection in front of him often held long enough for him to go through reads. There were drives where Ariante Ursary, Trent Brown, Jake Andrews, Ed Ingram, Titus Howard, and Blake Fisher passed off stunts, picked up blitzes, and kept jerseys off their quarterback so well that the Raiders never touched him for a single sack. That is real growth from where this group was in past seasons. It proves the Texans can build a clean launch point when the call sheet leans into the pass. The strange part is how solid pass work can live in the same game as a rushing attack that never felt like it got out of first gear. That contrast is exactly why this unit is so hard to judge right now. Run blocking tells a very different story. When the ball went to Nick Chubb or Jawhar Jordan, you rarely saw the line roll forward with confidence. Interior combos with Jake Andrews and Ed Ingram did not consistently move defenders off their spots. When Titus Howard slid inside, he had snaps where his feet and hands did not match cleanly, which matters when you're trying to climb to linebackers instead of just holding ground in pass protection. On the edge, Trent Brown can still anchor against a power rush, but finishing reach blocks and sealing defenders on outside concepts looked like a grind. It was not effort or toughness missing. It was timing, pad level, and chemistry in the tight spaces where run plays are born. That is why short yardage downs felt like a coin flip instead of a strength, and why every design carry looked one step away from popping, but never quite did. All of that puts the Texans at a crossroads in the trenches. They now know they have a pass unit that can give C.J. Stroud a fair shot against front sevens from teams like the Jaguars, Bills, and Chargers, but they also see that their ground game depends on cleaner work inside than they are getting from this current mix. That is where front office decisions and coaching details collide. Do you invest another premium pick at center? Do you chase one more veteran guard? Do you reshuffle roles for Titus Howard and Blake Fisher to squeeze more power out of the group? Those choices will shape how far this offense can carry its weight. And on the other side of the ball, there is another line fighting its own battle with health and depth. A defense that has carried this team for most of the year, but just showed how thin the margin really is when the wrong players are missing. This game was another reminder that the strength of the Houston Texans still lives on the defensive side, but it also showed how thin that strength can get when the wrong pieces are missing. When everything started to wobble, it was Derek Stingley Jr. changing the mood with that pick six, reading the route, jumping in front, and taking it all the way when the offense needed a spark. Off the edge, Will Anderson Jr. and Danielle Hunter kept flashing at key moments, squeezing the pocket, forcing hurried throws, and saving drives that felt like they were about to tilt toward Las Vegas. Inside, you still saw effort from guys like Sheldon Rankins and Tommy Togiai, fighting through double teams and holding the line just enough so that the Texans did not fully break in the red zone. On paper, that looks like a unit doing its job. The eye test says it was a lot closer to the edge than anyone in Houston wants to admit. The stress showed up every time the Raiders leaned on Ashton Jeanty and their play-action looks. Once Azeez Al-Shaair was out of the picture, the middle of the defense felt different. Henry To'oTo'o and E.J. Speed stepped in and battled, but there were snaps where angles were off. Tackles slipped, and Jeanty turned a simple check down into a long score that flipped the stadium energy. On the back end, the Texans were coming off a week where Trey McBride got loose for multiple touchdowns, and this time they had to deal with Brock Bowers and Michael Mayer near the goal line. Credit to Matt Burke and the secondary for tightening that part up, with Callan Bullock spending more time near the box, Miles Bryant and Jalen Reed handling space better, and Kamari Lassiter and Derek Stingley Jr. squeezing windows so the tight ends never fully took over. Even with those fixes, you could see how much they missed the rotation of Tim Settle and Mario Edwards Jr. Because without those fresh legs inside, explosive runs and broken tackles became a bigger part of the story than they should be for a group that has worn the label of best defense in football. That is what makes this performance so tricky to judge. You can say the defense did enough, forced short drives, created a touchdown on their own, and again carried a big part of the load during this win streak. You can also say that the missed tackles, the long catch and run from Ashton Jeanty, and the lack of steady push up front are exactly the kind of cracks. Quarterbacks like Trevor Lawrence and Justin Herbert will attack without mercy. The Texans know their identity on this side of the ball, and they know it cannot slip, especially when the offense is still trying to find itself. The real tension now comes from one simple truth that sets up the next part of this story. When a defense is playing this close to the limit, one long play or one late flag can swing everything. And in this game, that is exactly what happened. One penalty changed the whole feeling of this game. Deep in their own end, facing a distance that should have ended the drive right there, the Houston Texans saw a yellow flag hit the turf and the stadium flipped from panic to relief in 1 second. Raiders fans saw a chance to steal the game. Texans fans saw their season flash in front of them, and that single call turned a desperate snap into new life. If you are being honest, you know exactly why this moment will be replayed more than the final score. It did not just extend a drive, it reshaped how both fan bases talk about this win. From the Texan side, that penalty will always feel like the break that let their stars finish the job. Instead of punting from the shadow of their own goal line and handing momentum away, C.J. Stroud stayed on the field. The offense could breathe, and the ball finally found Nico Collins again to close the door. From the Raiders' view, it looks like the kind of contact that happens on every weekend, with corners like Derek Stingley Jr., Kamari Lassiter, or Callan Bullock fighting for position on the ball and trusting the officials to let both sides compete. That is why the emotion is so sharp. If the same flag had landed on a Texans defender in that situation, this fan base would be just as furious. It is not about blame. It is about how thin the line is between a heroic stand and a long walk back to the locker room thinking about what might have been. Big picture. This is where you see how fragile an entire playoff push can be. One whistle, one judgment call, can swing field position, shape the narrative around DeMeco Ryans, and even change how people view the balance between discipline and luck for this team. The Texans did not control the flag, but they did control what happened after, staying composed, avoiding their own meltdown, and closing the game without giving the officials another chance to step in. Now the real story moves beyond that moment. In a crowded AFC race, where every win or loss changes the map overnight, this escape in Las Vegas has a ripple effect on seeding, matchups, and pressure for the final stretch. And that bigger picture is where the next part of this breakdown really starts. Across the rest of the AFC, that narrow Texans win did not happen in a vacuum. While Houston was scraping past the Raiders, Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars were smashing their way through Denver, the Buffalo Bills were grinding out another close result, and Justin Herbert had the Chargers walking. Past teams that were supposed to give them trouble. You look at the conference board right now, and it feels less like a clean ladder and more like traffic at rush hour. A small move from any team shifts 3 or 4 others at the same time. That is why this one result in Las Vegas matters far beyond one nervous night. It keeps Houston inside the mix where every week someone new looks like a threat. For the Texans, the math is simple and cruel. Catching Trevor Lawrence for the division now depends on help from the Indianapolis Colts and Tennessee Titans, while DeMeco Ryans has to guide his group through a stretch that includes Justin Herbert and a physical Colts roster that always seems to turn games ugly. That is the trade-off when you play with fire against a struggling opponent. You keep your record strong, but you lose the luxury of dropping one later. The wild card picture is even more crowded, with Drake May and the New England Patriots, the Buffalo Bills, and the Chargers all fighting for placement that decides who walks into January facing a complete team like Baltimore and who gets a slightly cleaner matchup. One swing result, one tiebreaker, can be the difference between flying across the country to face a hot defense or hosting a game in front of Battle Red Nation. So when you step back from the panic of that final drive in Vegas, the real question is not just where the Texans sit today. It is what version of this team will show up for the last stretch inside this packed conference. Are they the group that leans on Derek Stingley Jr., Will Anderson Jr., Fairbairn to steal tight games while the offense searches for answers? Or can C.J. Stroud, Nico Collins, Nick Chubb, and Jawhar Jordan help turn Houston into a side that scares these other AFC hopefuls before the ball is even kicked? The standings only tell part of the story. The rest comes down to ceiling. And that is where this breakdown goes next, because the real topic now is not how many games the Texans have won. It is whether this version of Houston can truly frighten the best teams in this conference when the playoffs start. The biggest truth hiding inside this ugly win is that the Houston Texans now sit in a place most teams never reach. They have a defense with true star power, an offense with real talent, and a record that keeps them in every serious conversation. Yet they still have not come close to their cleanest version. Nights like this show how high the ceiling really is. Derek Stingley Jr. is taking the ball away and turning it into points. Will Anderson Jr. and Danielle Hunter are closing pockets when the game tilts. Fairbairn keeps stacking pressure kicks that change entire weeks of work. When you mix that with names like C.J. Stroud, Nico Collins, Nick Chubb, and Jawhar Jordan on the other side, this is not a team that should be happy just to sneak into the tournament. This is a roster that has the pieces to make people nervous the moment the schedule shows Houston as their matchup. The gap between that potential and what we just watched is where everything gets real. On defense, the standard only holds if players like Azeez Al-Shire, Tim Settle, Mario Edwards Jr., Sheldon Rankins, Tommy Togiai, Kalen Bullock, Kamari Lassiter, Jalen Pitre, Miles Bryant, and Jalen Reed stay sharp and connected so explosive plays do not become a weekly habit. On offense, C.J. Stroud has to turn this Raiders game into a turning point, not a pattern, getting back to trusting his eyes, feeding Nico Collins before the final drive, and using the run support from Nick Chubb, Jawhar Jordan, and Woody Marks, instead of waiting for rescue drives at the end. Up front, the group of Ariante Ursary, Trent Brown, Jake Andrews, Ed Ingram, Titus Howard, and Blake Fisher has already shown it can protect long enough for a top passing game. The next step is turning that same unit into a force that lets Nick Caley call anything he wants without worrying if the line can move people when it is time to play power football. Around the conference, quarterbacks like Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert, and Drake May are starting to look like the ones who will shape the AFC stories for the next few years. DeMeco Ryans and Matt Burke have already built a defense that belongs in that same era. The question now is whether this entire Texans team is ready to grow into that level of threat, not just for one hot month, but for an entire playoff run. If the tackling cleans up, if the communication on the back end stays tight. If CJ Stroud turns this season back toward the calm, deadly timing he showed before, then people will stop calling this win lucky and start calling it the night Houston learned how dangerous it can be when it survives its worst and still finds a way. And when the Texans walk into January with that version of themselves, no team at the top of the bracket will be able to look at this draw and feel relaxed.